You can't replace part of the brain. Like,
You treat them the same.
Source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the puppets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the $90 billion company. They had help up high, a lot of things.
State of Medtech with your host, Omar M. Khatib.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm joined by a good friend and guest today, Marc Zemel, who's the CEO of Retia Medical. Really excited about this conversation, which we'll get into, mainly because, one interesting thing that's happening in the world of medicine is this challenging of a business model. I think Burke Toss of Senti AR many years ago asked at LSI, are we going to get away from this razor blade model and change the model in general? Like, will it be somebody in medtech or will it be somebody in big tech? I always thought that medtech was going to be the one that leads that charge. And Retia is kind of a really great example of that. So Marc, maybe before we get into sort of the details, and of course, you guys launched a new product, maybe get a little bit of background on yourself and how you got involved starting Retia.
Sure. And Omar, it's a real pleasure to finally be on your podcast. I know we've known each other for a few years and been looking forward to chatting with you this afternoon. I started Retia now 14 years ago. I trained as a mechanical engineer and I worked in the capital equipment industry, making machines for microelectronics production. And then as people do, I decided to switch careers and go into med tech. Went back, got my MBA, and worked at Becton Dickinson for a few years in their with their anesthesia, hypodermic, infusion businesses. Got to know and really enjoyed working with anesthesiologists. But I was really more of a startup guy, at heart. And when I left BD, I connected with Rama Makamala, who's now a professor of bioengineering at University of Pittsburgh. At the time, he was at Michigan State, and he showed me this technology he was working on for essentially better algorithms for monitoring hemodynamics. And the example that he shared with me was one where they simulated bleeding for trauma. And, if you bleed, obviously the amount of flow pumped by your heart would go down. And the older monitors in this space would show that flow was going up, right? The wrong direction. And so I said, I don't need a PhD in statistics. I got it, right? So then, as I say, we were two guys with slides. I, licensed the technology, raised the capital, took it through FDA, CE mark. Today we're in 60 hospitals, 15 different countries. And as of February, we launched with Medtronic as our distribution partner in the US. So it's an exciting time, and we're not done yet. A lot more to do.
Fantastic. Yeah, and congratulations. I mean, first of all, that you guys are like commercial and generating revenue, but also like landing some of those partnerships with a strategic like Medtronic is only more sort of confirmation about the value of the technology. So for like an investor who's listening, if they were to ask you, what's your main beachhead? Like, what would that beachhead be? And the reason why I ask is that your technology is one of those things that can easily be applied in so many different clinical settings, but every technology has its like first and major beachhead that kind of opens itself up to a market for adoption. What would that be for you guys?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, right? Because this technology is used in high-risk surgery cases and in the ICU. So it really straddles both areas. I think what I would say is I go to people and say, give me your toughest patients, right? So you're talking cardiac surgery, transplants, thoracic cases, cancer surgeries, neuro, anybody who's really sick, trauma, right? Those are all in the OR. And then you look at people like in the ICU, after these surgeries, or burn patients, septic patients, obviously a very risky scenario. So it really depends, but these are the highest risk cases that you're worried about in the hospital.
Got it. And then with the platform that you have, what specifically does it solve? Is it just that, better hemodynamic led patient care is what's going to help like make better decision in terms of like therapies to use in patient management, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's, our tagline is better data saves lives, right? And then you're like, well, what does that really mean? So historically in this space, the monitors have overpromised and underdelivered. So you have something, the long-standing traditional way was to put a catheter and thread it through your heart into the pulmonary artery, right, to get a number, which is blood flow, right? And now they're even doing things like implantables, like, my friend Harry Rowland, and he sold Endotronics to Edwards, right? That's an implantable to measure PA pressure, right, for a number, right? And we said, well, what if we could do that with an algorithm that analyzes a signal that we already get, and that we analyze a blood pressure signal, and those technologies have been around also for 20 or 30 years, but they weren't consistently accurate. So you had either very invasive, right, which has all sorts of corresponding risk, or less invasive but not accurate, right? That's the problem that we solve. So by getting better data, right, better accuracy, we're now earning and have earned the trust of clinicians to implement care protocols that lead to better outcomes, like preventing kidney injury, cardiac injury, even surgical site infections, can all go down when you titrate your fluids, your, other medications to maintain perfusion to a patient's vital organs. So perfusion meaning delivery of oxygen, right? If you don't have enough oxygen going to your organs, then they start to die, right? So, you got to have data that you trust to then implement care to improve the outcomes. Those are that's a sort of step-by-step approach.
Yeah, and I think it's very timely just because we've, the discussion about data has been there for over a decade, but again, our the tools and technology we have access to just didn't help. So either you had like one of two routes, either less invasive but not as accurate, or really accurate but extremely invasive. And I feel like, especially in the last few years, like with the advent of like AI and NVIDIA, the access to these algorithms and the accuracy that they bring has really been, sort of exciting, especially for our field. Is that kind of how like Retia sort of evolved in the last few years in terms of adopting better trained algorithms, which is going to lead to maybe less invasive approaches?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's so instructive to me that, I was at Cleveland Clinic. They started with 2 monitors and now they have 60 and, 7 different hospitals. And I was talking to the head of one of their units there. He's like, unless it cures cancer, it's got to be plug and play, right? He's very direct about it. And the problem with a lot of these technologies is, you get 1 or 2 physicians that care to make the extra effort to get the data exactly, right? But your average clinician is going to have 120 other things they're focused on, right? And so it's not just that it had to be accurate, it had to be so intuitive, right? And, like I say, plug and play, which we also worked on, and then make it available at the bedside so you don't have to remember to grab this or that or set it up. It's just there. Like, Steve Jobs says, it just works, right? In our model, it's just there, right? And then it becomes habit. And so that's really the second piece, is reducing that friction to getting that data that is now accurate in the hands of everybody, because then when the data is available, then you come up with better care protocols, right, that lead to better outcomes. If you don't have the data, then you don't, innovate on the research side. So you have to create that flywheel.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned this. I think more medtech companies would be better off thinking more alongside of the Apple model, which is all their products are literally out of the box and ready to use. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that with it's a lot more, like what Apple does for the consumer, it doesn't even hold a candle to how difficult it is in the medical world, because as you mentioned, like clinicians are dealing with so many different new pieces of technologies and products and stuff that like they don't, even if they're interested, sometimes they just don't have the time, like it has to be flawless in terms of integration and usability.
That is, we took a consumer-led approach to the design of our user interface for that very reason. Nobody reads a manual anymore, right? And, we have to write this, 150-page manual with, how to do everything, and nobody reads it. Like, our sort of guiding light was they have to be able to unpack it and set it up themselves and figure it out, even if we're not there. Now, I don't like to do that, right? But that was the standard of evidence, because once you leave, there's a new nurse or there's a new anesthesiologist. They weren't in service. You saw with COVID, the turnover of nurses was 35% or more in some hospitals. It's a support nightmare. And then, why did we do this, right? To get people to use the product, right? So that piece is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep this in mind, especially in the world of surgery and critical care, is the amount of monitoring devices, and of course, like maybe if you can talk about it for a moment before we get deeper into the discussion. But alarm fatigue is also another thing, because it's not enough just for the for the, let's say, the surgeon or critical care physician. We're also talking about like the nurses, who are the ones who are like essentially managing the care of the patient for a much longer period of time and have more touch points.
Yeah, I had a clinician say to me early on during our focus groups, he's like, whenever we have alarms, I set the limits to 0 and infinity, right? And I silence them by default. I'm like, okay, that's really not what we're trying to do here. Thankfully, we're not a blood pressure alarm. We're not one of these like, critical alarms that people see on the, the regular multi-parameter monitor, like a GE or a Philips. But we do have alarms, and they're just visual, right? And they're there to, notify the patient, rather notify the clinician without disturbing the environment, right? But the question is, the point of an audible alarm is, well, what if they're not looking, right? And so, that's where we talk about making data available in multiple places so that people can access it, when they're not in the room, right? And so we're taking that approach rather than just, having something blast out into sort of the atmosphere, right? Which is a very crude way of, getting information to people.
Right. And your current iteration, at least in terms of what was your first iteration to get the adoption going, was essentially a critical care monitor. Now, a couple weeks ago at LSI, you had made this announcement that you're, making this sort of tectonic shift as a company to going more SAMD, which is software as a medical device. So, are you phasing out the monitor, and like tell us a little bit about that transition? And we talked a little bit about it before we got on this call, but for me, my interest was essentially that there's this opportunity for a new business model that goes outside of the whole like razor blade model, which is it's sold and outdated. I think there's some businesses that there's no getting around it. Like robotics, it's gonna stay razor blade. Maybe it'll have some slight iteration, but that's like the foundation of it. But there are other areas where there's opportunity for like real business model innovation.
Yeah, look, we're in the algorithm and software business, right? So the value of our technology is not the box, right? That's off the shelf stuff we buy and we assemble it and we send it out. Now, our competitors took the approach of making you buy a new sensor. That's their blade, right? But that sensor is not necessary. You can use a commodity sensor. We're talking a blood pressure sensor, the transducer that they plug into an arterial line to get your blood pressure on a beat to beat basis, right? A commodity one costs maybe $9 or $10, right? And the premium one that gives you the extra hemodynamics that we also provide, that sells for $250, $300. It's just a straight markup, right? And I looked at that and I said, why, right? Like, why can't we sell software, right? And then update that on a subscription basis. And the problem with that is I sell a box, it looks like capital, right? And I say it's really software, but they're like, no, it's capital. I'm like, okay, well, why don't we make software only and install it on a server? All these monitoring companies have central stations, and they have these EICUs or telecritical care platforms, like a air traffic control tower, where they're looking at 50 or 100 or 200 beds at a time and figuring out which is the one that needs, additional attention. And they're doing that in the OR too, with cameras and, digital surgery, all in the areas of improving care and quality and efficiency. And I said, these are the platforms that we need to move towards because that's what algorithms do. That's what this software is. They're improving your workflow. I mean, the competition from us is like, well, I could do it in Excel, or I could do it in, with a calculator, or, or some other science experiment where I inject this here and I watch there and I lift the legs and we work with some really smart MDs that can figure out something that could get to the same place. But, they got to spend half an hour at the bedside. And I said to you, like, why are we doing science experiments at the bedside? Why not just have the data available, right? And so then we decided to take the algorithm out of the box, right, and create this SAMD, right, this software that does any bed, anytime. So that means working with hospital IT to deploy it on a server, right? And they're already getting this data sent to them, to their central station. We're just picking it off and running our calculations on that and sending it back. So we launched a pilot at Cleveland Clinic about a month ago. They have in their e-hospital, they have 12 different campuses, over 200 beds, and they're ecstatic. They can see the data for wherever they are in the hospital, on their phone. They can even VPN from home and see what's happening. So, in a place where they don't have 24/7 intensivist coverage, this is huge, right? You get that call. It's always on the nights and weekends where the patient's in trouble. And, now you have better data to drive some decision making even before that person gets to the hospital. That's the first piece, right? Then in the OR, you have a lot of anesthesiologists that are supervising more than one OR at the same time, right? And it's the same kind of decision making. And when you look at where care is going, right, what do we see? We see increasing numbers of older, sicker patients showing up at the hospital, and we can't make nurses and doctors fast enough, right? And that's true in Japan, it's true in Europe, it's true in the US. And so how are we improving that care efficiency and that while maintaining care quality? Because the longer people work, the more mistakes they make, right? So that's where software has a really nice benefit. And then the question is, how do we get it in the hospital? How do we break that model of, well, where's the disposable, right? How do I pay for this, right? And I said, well, it's either go big or go home, right? Instead of selling 2 monitors here, 4 monitors there, 10 monitors here, let's do the entire department, do the entire hospital, do multiple hospitals, right? Yes, it's an IT project, but then the data's at your fingertips, right? And then that's a platform to deploy additional algorithms, right? To add to that intelligence, to augment, just like your app store, right? And then you keep adding more capabilities. We're going to do the same thing.
Interesting. So like, just to kind of break that back down, the problem with capital is that like you're always like retrofitting what's the need of the customer, again, like selling 2 versus 10 or 50 monitors, right? And in that case, actually, just for the education of the investors who might be listening, you still have to deal with IT because it's plugged into the system. Your thing is to just bypass that, not worry about selling the capital, go for the bigger stake, which is like, hey, we're going to sell a larger, ticket product here, which is the software. But once you're through IT and you're in, you can sort of land and expand. So I think it's like the same amount of trouble that you go through going through IT for like 2 monitors. It's almost the same as like a large, deploying a large software across hospital. The only difference is like the ticket price.
Might as well do a bigger deal. Yeah. I mean, look, there are hospitals.
It's like my business too. I just realized I'm like, great way to grow a business, just solve more expensive problems.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not to say we won't sell boxes, right? I mean, we partnered with Medtronic. They're going to sell boxes way better than we could on our own, right? Some hospitals, they want to dip their toe in the water before they convert, all 100 beds. No problem. Buy 2, buy 4, use it for a year or 2, get comfortable with it, and then talk to me and we'll kit out the whole hospital, right? So it's not either or, right? But, I like to say we meet people where they are, right? So some people they get it and they don't need to try, using it for a year, right? And they just want to go and kit it out everywhere. Wonderful. There are people that are building their next generation digital OR or their next generation digital ICU, slot in perfectly. And then there are folks that are like, okay, I want to get there, but I'm implementing Epic right now, right? So talk to me in 2 years. Or we're just changing something else, right? Well, here's how I can help you today. So I want to be clear. It's not, one instead of the other. It's, these things evolve over time. I'd like to say that I could digitize every hospital tomorrow. It's not happening, right? But we have to show a vision of where we're going, right? Because the days of putting more screens at the bedside are, dwindling, right? So this is the wave of the future because how are you going to deploy more intelligence, right? It can't be another screen.
Everybody, quick break. If you're a medtech CEO or a product leader, you're going to want to listen to this. Now, I want you to imagine you're about to have a product launch. You've poured your time, your budget, your reputation into a device you're about to launch. And after all of that effort, your FDA submission, poof, gets rejected because of cybersecurity. This sounds dramatic, but it's actually not. It happens all the time to medtech companies, especially, recently with everything being digitized. This happens so often because medtech companies treat cybersecurity as a checkbox when it's now a non-negotiable design pillar. The FDA's 2023 guidance didn't suggest cybersecurity, it demanded it. So if you're not ready with threat modeling, penetration testing, SBOM management, incident response, and airtight documentation, you're not launching, period. And here's what most entrepreneurs don't realize. Scrambling to fix these issues last minute can cost over $250,000 and delay your launch by months, which imagine the investment of getting delayed, right? The more you spend time in review limbo with the FDA is lost revenue, lost market share, and lost investor confidence. And yet, so many founders and entrepreneurs I talk to, they still treat cybersecurity as a postscript instead of a strategic advantage. Now, I've held off bringing this to my audience as a topic until now because there just wasn't a medtech-focused cybersecurity firm that I trusted, and that changed when I found Blue Goat Cyber. They specialize exclusively in medtech cybersecurity. They've helped companies like bioMaru, Inogen, Natera, along with nimble startups to get to market faster with a 100% FDA success rate. I had the chance to meet the founder, Christian Espinosa, and his story really resonated with me. So after he sold his first cybersecurity company, Alpine Security, Christian actually faced a personal health crisis. He ended up in the hospital, and that moment made him realize how vital and vulnerable medical devices really are because a medical device saved his life. So he built Blue Goat to serve medtech CEOs and founders just like you. Whether you're pre-revenue or scaling fast, Blue Goat can offer fixed-free pricing, unlimited retests, and no surprises. This isn't bolt-on security. This is built in from day one. You wouldn't launch a device that hasn't been clinically validated, so why would you risk launching one that's vulnerable to attack? Blue Goat will secure your device, simplify your submission, accelerate your approval, and they'll do it in a way that fits your budget, your timeline, and your team. So here's what I want you to do next. Go to bluegoatcyber.com, schedule a discovery call. They do these amazing calls. They'll do an analysis with you, educate you more, because the cost of waiting could be everything that you've worked for. So that being said, go to bluegoatcyber.com and schedule that call now. Let's get back to the episode. So the new software, from your LSI presentation, you talked about it. It was Argos Infinity. Now, one of the things that you put, or at least presented, that was interesting is that your ARR, or annual recurring revenue, for this market opportunity is about $15 million at a 15% CAGR. Talk to us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so I think I put down 115 million was the potential, and that's based on a model of the current. I was looking mainly at the EICU or tele-ICU market. I guess in retrospect, I should probably start adding the OR piece to that, so it's actually probably larger. From a bed count standpoint, we think more about ICUs, because probably 80-20 ICU beds to OR beds where our current platform is relevant. But from a volume standpoint, obviously the OR is a more important market. but that market, the telecritical care space, has been growing pretty steadily in the teens, right? And people are continuing to add that software um, because of this challenge of resource coverage, right? That you can just pool your number of intensivists, right? Much better if you can have somebody on call managing those nights and weekends for 50 beds or 100 beds instead of 12 beds, right? And we see this all the time where people say, "Oh, I want a hemodynamic monitor for my satellite hospital," and we show up and they're like, "Well, we only need it like once or twice a week." And our competitors' list price is like $100,000 for a monitor. And I'm like, they just can't manage that. But what if I gave you access to the data on a per bed charge? That's such a small fraction of that, right? So, we're modeling somewhere around, let's say, 2,500 per bed per year, right? Where you're looking at this and you're like, hey, I have that now to enhance my patient safety annually, where if I can avoid one acute kidney injury or one bleeding event, that pays for years worth of the software subscription,
Right.
right? So
And just because
that's
it's,
where this is going, right?
yeah, and just for context, I mean, like acute kidney injury is a huge, huge issue. I think a lot of people don't realize how big. So just in the U.S. alone, I think it's a lot higher personally, but like the recorded estimates about like 300,000 died just from AKI. And just for context for the listeners, like I think breast and colon cancer, breast, colon, and some other cancer, I think all combined are still not that high, right? And one AKI episode, I think is like 15, 20 grand to the hospital. So like the numbers just, it just makes sense and it works out. And I think what's interesting again, like eh, comparing this business model to, let's say, the capital equipment piece, is that in order to service those accounts and everything, there's a cost to implementation, right? Versus if you go through IT and you already have that software there, like you just essentially flip a switch and you're able to expand and collect revenue without like, adding more to your costs, right?
Right. Yeah, my COGS are zero except for some server and other things, but it's not the same as, all this, metal and electronics and all of that and the maintaining of that. We just, we can push updates, right? Which is a much nicer um, business, right? From that point. Plus, it's recurring revenue. You get annual subscription versus capital is, you start from zero every year. But, the point about acute kidney injury that I want to emphasize here is that people talk about all these therapies, fluid management and other things that help reduce the acute kidney injuries, right? And you're familiar with this space. Um, the issue is not just the therapeutic, but detecting the problem. And if you don't have the information at every bed, then I like to say you have to be like the amazing Kreskin to know which patient you need to monitor, right? And all the risk scores in the world, are never going to be 100% accurate to get it so that you need it at that time on that patient. You don't want to wait. So that's why this sort of broad coverage is so important to maintain the surveillance, right? And then you don't have to wait for the right person to see the right data at the right time. We did this work at Johns Hopkins, 10,000 subjects, all non-cardiac surgery, and they ran our algorithm on all of them, and they're finding that, in fact, we can pick up problems that are directly related to increased rates of acute kidney injury, cardiac injury, even mortality, right? But it means you got to have it everywhere. You can't just sit there and pick and choose.
Right, right. And just on a sort of a related note, as you move more into the software as a medical device, one of our partners here is Blue Goat Cyber. I know that you guys had worked with them, but I think it's really important for the founders who are listening to kind of get your perspective on cybersecurity. I think in the past, it was one of those things, it was like a checkbox thing. But now, considering how much everything is digitized, the FDA is taking cybersecurity really seriously. Maybe you can kind of give some, I guess, your experience and take on cybersecurity and maybe some advice to some of the founders who are listening. And I'd say actually the investors too, because I think what I got educated more on cybersecurity is that it is such a major risk point for a company that if you don't take care of it correctly, like you can lose your opportunity to commercialize.
Yeah, it used to be that connectivity was a nice to have, and now it's a must have. So that's the foundation piece, right? 15 years ago, if your monitor connected to the MR, yeah, that's great, but it wasn't part of the decision as to whether they would buy, right? Now it's like if you don't have it, then that's a veto. So that's piece one. Once you open up the technology to then connect with, even the intranet and then with the outside world where we talk about with Argos Infinity, where we're pushing updates and other things, well, then cybersecurity is really important. We all have seen the stories, in the news about hospitals getting hacked, right? And you're worried about, information, personal health information getting into people's eyes that they shouldn't have, right? And then the FDA said, look, we need, right? They basically said they want somebody else to verify that your code is correct and pressure test it as you should, right? And Blue Goat has been an excellent partner. And, for good practice is to have somebody else review your code. I view it the same as like, we take our monitors right now and we put them through electrical safety testing with a third party that's an expert in this, right? And they come back and say, you need to change this, you need to change that, and we do it, and then we get it through. Same thing with Blue Goat. They're experts in this, right? They help us, make sure that we're designing the right architecture that's hardened against these attacks, and then pressure test it, and then get it out there. And I couldn't be happier with our partnership with them.
Yeah, and same here. I mean, it's been an area that I've always wanted to bring more education to my audience, but there wasn't really any company that solely focused on medtech, and especially was startup friendly. And so Blue Goat has been fantastic. Christian and his team are like really good. And then also like his own personal story about, being in the hospital and having a medical device save his life has been really sort of inspiring to hear. But yeah, no, it's interesting to see that, Mark, because, again, like I think 5-10 years ago, even with the desire from our industry to digitize more and use data, it's just been always tough, right? And that's kind of like the big thing, which is like in order like to actually train algorithms, you needed better hardware to capture the data. And now there's so many different devices that capture this data anyway, and it's in the hospital's records and in their data sets. And so being able to just access that through IT, and then essentially you're selling an algorithm like anything else, is really, really powerful. I mean, me personally in my own business, we use AI multiple different sets on a daily basis, from ChatGPT to Notebook LM to Perplexity, etc. And I mean, it's just, and we're at the very, very beginning. How do you see, like, if you were to scope out, because like you're one of the few companies that's actually deploying a version of AI through your software, like 5-10 years from now, do you think that the future of medtech is going to be kind of split between companies that just have hardware that help capture the data, and then companies that deploy the software to extrapolate that data? I mean, what do you see?
Yeah, I do, because and I want to say this, there are a lot of outstanding companies, right? Large strategics that with large moats and extremely talented, sales force, right, to sell razors and razor blades. And selling software is different, right? And so, when you think about a capability, right, it's changing the way that not just how the customers are using this, right, but how these companies have to go to market, right? And so that's not going away. And the companies that get on that bandwagon, and train their sales forces that way are going to be the ones that are going to move ahead, because, like we talked about earlier, we can't add more screens to the bedside, and we can't stick more, things in the patient. They're already too much of a pincushion, right? So where's the growth going to come from? Software.
Yeah, and I wonder if I wonder if the future for for medtech is, for certain areas, if it's just to say like, hey, XYZ company has like 30-40% of the market, their solution's already a standard and really good. What kind of software can we develop to enhance it? And I think maybe the way to look at it is kind of like the iPhone. Like, the iPhone is great, but really what made the iPhone better is that outside third parties developing certain apps to use it better. I mean, like, for example, Yosef Safi Harb at Happy Tech, they're using the smartphone essentially to scale cardiac monitoring for AFib. right? No
Right.
new hardware being made, but like software that's being deployed that's using the hardware.
Right. There are several companies in this space that are trying to build the ecosystem. I think that's a wild west right now. And the ecosystem, there's a question here: are you going to be iOS or are you going to be Android, right? And I think at least the people we've talked to view the ecosystem piece as a commodity, right? It's what apps do you have on it? I'm curious to see how that shakes out myself, because I think having a well-functioning ecosystem is also not trivial,
Yeah,
right?
no,
Right?
totally,
It's no joke,
totally.
right?
It's yeah, yeah.
But I don't know that the customers are thinking that way right now.
Yeah, because I think like in the consumer world, like for Apple, like no consumer is just thinking like, oh, like I own all this data. Why am I letting this company like develop an ecosystem around it? But hospitals are not stupid, right?
Yeah,
They're very, very different. And so I don't even know if it's going to be possible for one single company to kind of develop that ecosystem. It's just like really, really hard.
it's way more complicated than a phone. Yeah, like, but the ease of use piece matters. Like, whatever it was, 15, 20 years ago when I got my first iPhone, I don't remember, like my 2-year-old was using it. Couldn't even read, and she's navigating and she found a game. I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm done. Like, I don't need to be tech support for my whole family, right? It just has to work. There are enough things that go wrong in software and computers. This has to be as user-friendly experience as possible.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, just talking about like the larger companies, and I'm curious, one just for your opinion about it, but also to like, for a lot of investors, they're very interested to say like, okay, if this company has a great product, great business model, et cetera, like who is this going to be a great acquisition target for? So when it comes to ecosystems, the one company that, at least in my opinion, probably did the best job of having some ecosystem would be Intuitive. But, unlike other strategics, so Intuitive is, I think, behind Abbott, and Abbott's kind of like medtech slash biotech. Intuitive's got the largest market cap, but they've been extremely disciplined on just focusing on one specific area and kind of building around that. Other strategies like Edwards, Medtronic, Stark, I mean, they have so many different things. So if you had to kind of pick, like, who would you put? You can't pick Intuitive, but like, are there certain strategies that you personally feel like they have a good shot of developing some kind of an ecosystem like what you just described?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I mean, everybody I talk to is building some kind of ecosystem. Stryker has their digital department, BD has one, Medtronic obviously has one, Massimo has one. All these companies are realizing that they need to do it. But the tricky thing that I see is it's like Kodak. It's like they invented the digital camera, but they didn't commercialize it because they were selling film. And are they really going to put in the money and the effort to sell that ecosystem to get it out there, or would they rather just acquire it? I mean, you look at Philips, right? They acquired Capsule, right, because they had an ecosystem already in place. So, I don't sleep on the big patient monitoring companies for this because they're getting most of the data and they're the ones that, they're facing the competitive pressure from the likes of the Chinese companies that really can make hardware faster and cheaper, and service it way better than they can, right? So that would be some of the things I'm thinking about in this space.
And at least for you, I mean, Medtronic is one obvious one because they have a distribution agreement with you. But some other companies that might be potential acquirers for Retia would what at least who comes to mind for me is like Edwards, Baxter. I mean, who else are plays in this space?
Yeah, well, BD is our primary competitor. They bought the Edwards Critical Care Division now last.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Massimo bought Lidco. Baxter bought Cheetah Medical years ago. We're enjoying the partnership with Medtronic. There are many other names that could be very interesting. I look at both the patient monitoring companies like I talked about, or some mid caps that are doing some very interesting things in where they're building that foundation of software only sales from the ground up.
Let me, before we wrap up, and again, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a long time coming. Again, I'll mention it now that we just talked, but like, it's one of those things where, I have friends in the space and I'm like, oh yeah, like Mark's been on the show. And then I realize I'm like, oh, we've done so many episodes, like he has not been on. So I'm glad we finally made this happen. But because you've made the shift to say, hey, this data is being captured already by something else. We just need to plug in and make that data a lot more valuable. Is there some wild alternate universe where a company like Apple could acquire Retia, because of what you guys do? Is that a possibility?
Well, that would be really interesting. I'll tell you this, and this is a good way to kind of think about it. We're on the journey to building a digital physiologic twin, right? And if you think about it, we're focused on critical care right now, but we're going less and less invasive, and we're deploying our algorithms in ways where even people, pre-hospital environment, they're in trouble. And what do they all have? They have an Apple Watch, right? What if they had their algorithms that we provide, again, using existing sensing technology, so nothing that they don't normally do, right? To help really understand their condition. I can route you to this hospital versus that hospital. I can send the information ahead of time, right? Or I can call you and say, why don't you drive yourself to the hospital before the emergency happens, right? Before, you're unconscious, because I saw something, right? That's the direction we're going as a company. And then that gets really interesting, right? Because it is a crossover into the folks that are trying to do this, in the consumer space.
It's interesting, and we'll see, because like big tech had its like move into med device and med tech and healthcare 10 years ago, and it was funny that they thought they can just come in and save everybody, and that's just not how it works. I mean, we all remember when the biggest companies on planet, JP Morgan, Amazon, and Berkshire, were like, hey, we're gonna save healthcare, and then that thing like wrapped up in like 3 years. It's really, really difficult. So it's kind of interesting to see moving forward how big tech starts to move into medtech, and I think more through the view of partnerships and acquisitions versus like they can't just jump in on their own. And it's a really hard space for a reason.
Yeah, look, if it were solved already, I wouldn't have a job, right? I mean,
yeah, no,
right?
you and me both, man. So look, Mark, thank you so much for coming to the show. I'm really excited to follow along and see how you guys progress, and of course, see you back in LSI next year with some updates. For those who are listening, whether you're a clinician or an investor, you can learn more about the company at retiamedical.com. That's spelled RETIA medical.com. And of course, Mark's active on LinkedIn, so be sure to give him a follow. And as always, I'm your host, Omar Khatib. Make sure you subscribe to the show, give us 5 stars, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.